Ryan, thank you so much for being here today on the podcast. I really appreciate it. How you doing?
Good.
Good to hear. We're in your studio, and this studio is insane. Thank you so much for allowing me into your home, into your studio. You're currently on tour with Billy Ray Cyrus. Is that right?
Yeah, I play keys with him. We haven't played in a little while, but I am in his band.
How's that experience been when you're out on the road with him?
It's been really fun. That's the biggest gig I've ever had playing, or biggest artist I've ever played for, and it's really cool. One time we took a private jet and went to California and back in the same day.
Oh, wow.
Flew back after the gig. I had never experienced that before.
That's crazy, man. And you bring 2 keyboards?
I do.
To his tour?
I have 2 Nords. I have a Stage 3 that's weighted, full 88 Nord, and then I have an older stage that's a Stage 2 compact that I've had for like 15 years probably. I'll just use it for organ sounds, and then I use a ventilator pedal, which is a Leslie simulator pedal, and I'll just leave that on for that Nord.
Sweet.
Because that gig's mostly piano and organ. So I'll just have a piano board and then organ on top. And
Sweet, man.
I might use a couple other little sounds, but that's the main part of it.
Very cool, man. So today we're going to be talking about tips for how to be a touring musician. And with that, we're going to be talking about just practical tips and also tips on patches and sounds and cool things. If you look up Ryan Prewett music, you will be blown away by his creativity. You had a Christmas album out this past Christmas. I just checked it out last week, I believe, but you have music coming out all the time. And I know you're working on a project right now. You want to tell us a little bit about the project you're working on?
Yeah, so most of my music that I do for me is retro funk, soul, kind of pop influence from like 60s soul and funk all the way to 80s synth funk and Prince and that kind of thing.
Yeah, man.
Like the Christmas album you mentioned, that was kind of an organ album, kind of like
Which I love.
I like Booker T and the MGs a lot and the Meters and
Right.
that 60s funk that's not real complicated and just feels good and is fun. So a lot of it was influenced by that. The new project is I'm getting into creating some sample library type stuff, and it's not like loops or like drum sound samples. It's actual compositions of like pieces basically I've written that sound like old records that people could sample a chunk from like they would if they were crate digging and looking through vinyl records.
That's cool.
So I'm getting into that and learning about that because there's a whole industry around that. They're not always royalty free in those cases. So right now I'm not making it royalty free where people can make beats and tracks with the samples. And then if it gets a certain number of plays or gets released with a certain number of plays and that type of thing, they'll be where I need to be included as a producer or whatever. So I'm figuring all that out and learning about doing that. And I almost have finished. Basically, it's a whole album of 10 compositions that sound like cinematic soul from the 70s. Like
That's awesome.
Isaac Hayes, Curtis Mayfield, the movie Shaft, and those like 70s cop show movies and that kind of thing. So that's what I've been creating recently, and it's been really fun. It's all live orchestration with strings and horns, and all the instruments are live. There's some background vocals and some hooks and stuff. Just cool things that I would think would be cool to sample, and that sounds like a movie soundtrack from the 70s.
And there was a genre of music that you just showed me before we started this episode. Ryan was talking about ska, and I've never heard of the genre of ska. It's like from the, 60s or 70s?
It started, I think, in the 60s and 70s and developed out of reggae music and then had some resurgences like in the 90s.
Yeah.
And there were different versions. Like in the 90s, there was like punk, kind of like fast punk reggae with horns. And when I was in high school, I had a ska band. And then I had one in college. And
you played saxophone.
I did play saxophone in that, and keyboard, and even guitar. And
that's fun,
It's pretty silly, but it was fun at the time. And
that's awesome. Well, if you don't know ska music, you're like me, and go check it out, because it's pretty cool. A lot of horns, reggae mix.
Yeah, it's fast.
Yeah, it's fun times.
There was a dance called the skank you could look up.
The skank,
where it was like silly.
Okay.
Kind of went with the groove, and
Nice.
we would always be kind of in the realm of like local punk bands and heavier bands and stuff. So we'd be
Right.
on these local shows with those kinds of bands, and yeah, that was the late 90s, early 2000s was a thing.
Tell us a little bit about the touring world in general. And by the way, Ryan has been on tour with New Song as well. So if you're familiar with the Christian world, you know about New Song, and he was on tour with them in 2019. And he's done stuff with a lot of different artists over the years. But tell us a little bit about touring world and how I even got into the touring world.
So I grew up playing classical piano, took lessons probably for 7 or 8 years, and then studied for 1 year in college. And I didn't really grow up with like funk and soul music that I do now. And then in college, I just met a more diverse friend group, and I grew up in a small town and just didn't have stuff like that around as much. When I went to college, I just made a lot of different friends and discovered a bunch of stuff I had never really listened to, even like D'Angelo and stuff that I had never even heard of, and just got real deep into funk and soul and where it originated from and all that, and learned more of that type of keys stuff. And
Right.
I've never been like a jazz player. I didn't study jazz. I studied a little bit, but not a real jazz pianist or anything. So I just kind of found my groove with the funk and soul, and just stuck since then. And it's been my favorite stuff. And so I went to school for recording and ended up graduating from MTSU. I moved to Murfreesboro, which is close to Nashville here, and then planned on mostly doing recording, like as a producer and engineer. And then I started playing more and realized I liked playing on the road, and or just not really on the road yet, but just playing gigs more, and realized what the demand for musicians in Nashville is and how it worked. I was like, well, I want to play more, and I started playing more, and eventually did some road gigs. But I've always been more focused on producing and mixing.
Yeah.
And nowadays, most gigs I take usually have to be pretty fun for me to leave and not be able to work in my studio. And so it's got to be pretty fun, or just pay a lot of money, honestly. There's like a balance of that. So I'm not playing on the road as much now. I like playing with Billy when he plays. I might pick up some gigs here and there besides that, but not a whole lot. It takes a lot now to be able to miss just working here.
Right.
And keeping the momentum going on all my original music. And then I do a whole lot of mixing for other producers and some producing for other people and stuff. And that's always been the main focus.
How did you get started on your first tour? How did you even get connected with that world?
I was just around Nashville playing local gigs and just meeting people. I don't even remember really what the first road gig would have been for me. When you're starting out, you kind of just take whatever you can as you figure out kind of where you fit in or where you can be the most use to people. And so I would just take whatever gigs I could. And
Yeah. What are your favorite like artists or influencers growing up that you really took from them and really inspired you?
Growing up, I listened to a lot of different music than I do now, because I got into like funk and soul in college, and my favorite artists are like Stevie Wonder and Prince and the standard artists of that type of stuff. James Brown, like pretty much everything from the 60s to the 80s. But growing up, I listened to a lot of CCM music, played at church, and listened to ska music, obviously.
There you go.
And played that and had like different bands in high school. And my dad plays guitar and plays at church and plays country music in a country band in my hometown. And so I was exposed to a lot of that. My grandpa played bluegrass music, so I was exposed to that. And I used to play some guitar and learn from my dad, and would play with my grandpa and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I grew up. Just got exposed to different music in college and kind of changed
So where are you from originally?
I'm from Missouri, in a small town called Dixon. It's in the Ozarks.
Then you made your way here to Nashville or Murfreesboro for MTSU
Yep.
for school.
Yep. I graduated from MTSU in 2010 and then stuck around since then.
Can you tell us a little bit of pros and cons of the touring world in general?
I'd say the pros mostly is it's fun unless you're just out there with bad people or people you don't want to be around.
Right.
Which can happen. The cons, I'd say the biggest thing is you might always be looking for another gig because gigs come and go, and even good gigs can come and go pretty easily.
Yeah.
And so you might have a good gig and it pays well and it's consistent, and then it can just kind of be gone based on the artist or whatever reason.
Right.
People get let go from gigs, not even because they did anything wrong, just for whatever reason. I'd say the biggest thing is you probably have to be able to pivot and flex and find new gigs. You can get a big artist gig that's a salaried gig and you're on retainer.
Oh, nice.
But that's not very many. That's like the biggest artists there are. So even like a lot of country artists in Nashville that are famous, the musicians aren't on salary. So it's still per show pay rate, and if they're not touring, you may not be making money and whatever. So I'd say that's the biggest thing. And what I tell people generally, in like starting out in the music industry, is to create something that you own, that you can monetize or build, that you have control of. So you can still tour, do whatever you want. But like when I started doing my own music and making some money from sync licensing and building a brand of my own for all that stuff, that's like something I can continually make money with and own and be in control of somewhat. It doesn't even have to be your own music. Tutorials or lesson videos, or there's something that you can continually call your own.
Absolutely.
Even if it's not a big thing, it can generate income. Just nice to have something to help build. Because as you get older, you'll want something, like you don't want to always be looking for the next gig.
That's good advice, man. There might be someone listening, maybe they're 17-year-old at their church playing keys right now. They've been playing for 3 or 4 years or so, and they're dreaming of maybe coming to a city like Nashville and actually doing the music thing. Can you kind of talk about your journey from being a hobbyist into making this a career, and what advice you'd have for someone who really loves it and wants to make it in the music industry, but they're not around people that feed into that reality? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you really, I think, just have to move somewhere where there's opportunity. It's really hard to get a touring gig if you're in a town far away from the gig.
Right.
So Nashville is probably the easiest place to do that because it's still cheaper to live here relatively than like New York or LA or other big cities where there's a music industry with actual commerce happening. It is more expensive now than like when we moved here. But it still seems like the easiest way to get into it because there is a huge demand for musicians still. And just there's all kinds of gigs. Like now, like even on Broadway, people are making a lot of money. We used to, that didn't make as much money, but I hear of a lot of people making good money doing that, which not everybody wants to do that. Every month there's like a new wedding band being created because this is like a top spot for destination weddings, and there's just so many bands that need musicians. And so there's a lot of opportunities for gigs aside from artist gigs and that type of thing to help fill in the gaps when you're not on the road. I definitely would say you need to move to wherever there's touring happening.
Absolutely.
And there's some people, once you get established in Nashville, if you have some like an established gig or so, you can move away as long as you come back when you need to get on the bus or be able to travel. Some people do that when they get older for family reasons or whatever, and it's harder. But you definitely have to move here, I think, or move somewhere to get started and just be there where people will know you and you can meet people and just be in the mix of what's happening.
What would you say, since nowadays people can post and play online, all the time. How big of an influence is that, and what would you say to people to be able to utilize that?
I don't think it's necessary by any means, because there's a lot of good touring musicians in Nashville that nobody knows online. And then there's some that do have a presence because they've built that up. Probably sometimes people get hired from that type of thing, but I would say creating something online like that is more helps with what I was saying earlier, where you're creating your own fan base and your own thing where you can potentially monetize. That's a big thing with guitar players. I know probably more than keys players. People like Guthrie Trapp and well-known guitar players in Nashville that just create their own brand and their own thing that just revolves around what they're doing, which is very good. Like they're very good at it, but they just created this thing around them. So I know like with guitar players and probably drummers, like the online thing is bigger because so many people obsess over stuff.
Right.
So I don't know about keys players if it's as much, but
Cool, man.
it's definitely worth doing if you can find a way to do cool stuff online and build an audience and
For sure.
be seen that way.
Tell us a little bit. So you play at Cross Point Church.
I do.
Here in Nashville. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a pretty big church downtown Nashville, and then it has several satellite campuses. So the worship team gets moved around. Everybody gets moved around to the different campuses as needed.
Awesome.
I've gone to Cross Point for a long time and just didn't get on the worship team because I was traveling more on the weekends and wasn't really able to commit to it. But now that I'm mostly in town, I decided it was time, and
There you go.
I play usually a couple weekends a month.
What are your goals and aspirations for the future of what you're doing? You want to create more of your music and keep collaborating with artists, right?
Yeah, that's my main focus now. Is probably two things are my main focus. One is my own music and just keeping it going, because one reason I've been able to build it up with streaming and build an audience is I've put out a lot of music since I started in probably 2017.
17 is when saw your first.
Yeah. So I've put out several songs a year. I've put out a couple albums, lots of singles. So keeping that momentum going is important, I think. Just keep that building because it's been working. So,
And a lot of them are instrumental, right?
some of them, I'd say more of them are with featured artists, and there are some that are instrumental. A lot of the Christmas stuff was instrumental, but most of the time, like if it's a single, it's usually with a featured artist.
Very cool.
It's kind of like a, to me, when I started doing it, it was like kind of like a Mark Ronson type thing, because Mark Ronson was doing that, and then on a much higher level, obviously, and then he did Uptown Funk, and like Uptown Funk's not on a Bruno Mars album, it's on a Mark Ronson album. So like,
okay,
and that kind of clicked. Like, oh, I could do that because I don't sing. I'm not going to be that type of artist. But if I want to produce the stuff that I want to produce and not just be dependent on what somebody's going to hire me for, I just need to create it and then kind of figured out how to feature my friends that are good artists. And so I just want to keep it building and try to work with some bigger artists as I go along. Now that I have a little bit of like some stuff going on, I can reach out to other artists that are a little further along and just keep it growing. And then the other thing, I do a lot of mixing for other producers, and I enjoy that a lot. So I'm still just trying to build that up and keep that going, and do a lot of like pop country and pop, R&B kind of mixing.
Tell us a little bit about, so you love playing around with different sounds, different patches. You have wonderful hardware gear. You have like the real stuff here in the studio, the Prophet and the organ, the Hammond over there. Tell us a little bit about when you sample things and how you use them within your productions, and just when you use it live or when you use it here in the studio. Like what does that look like? Tell us a little bit about the world of sampling.
Well, most of the sampling I'm doing now, I'm like writing tracks that would be sampled by somebody else. So it's not so much like creating patches for a keyboard. I do that sometimes because I only use a Nord. It's not worth it to me to haul around a bunch of heavy stuff, and a lot of it's old, and like it's just not for my gigs. Yeah, it's not worth it. So I will samples. Like I've sampled some sounds out of my Prophet before, because I use my Prophet a lot. That's probably my main synth that I've had for a long time now. And so if once in a while I will do a session somewhere else where I'm playing keys, And sometimes I'll take the Prophet in a Nord, or I'll just use my Nord because I've sampled some of the sounds I use a lot into the Nord. And so the Nord, there's a really good sample software that you can get for just use download, and then you can sample stuff and then upload it to the Nord as a patch, and it's all just Nord software. So it works pretty well from when I've used it. I've even loaded like sounds like vocal chops and things where I just trigger them with my Nord.
Oh, nice.
Because I don't ever take a laptop, mostly because I'm too lazy to take all that stuff and I don't want to like deal with it. And
yeah,
I used to a long time ago, and I don't really run tracks much unless it's an artist that already has their own tracks rig, or a church where there's already a rig. So if I do load samples for something like that, I'll just load it into the Nord and I can just hit a key and it'll be somebody's vocal intro or something like that.
Right. Okay. Very cool, man. You talked about how when you grew up, you took classical piano lessons, and then now you're doing this funk soul stuff. Tell us a little bit about because there's a world of difference between the classical world and then creating your own music. How did you transition from learning to play the sheet music note by note and, ultimately be a copyist of a pianist? High respect to everyone who plays classical music, but how did you transition from classical to funk and more stuff by ear? How was that for you?
Well, I always, even when I took classical lessons and like in high school, I probably had stopped by high school, but I would learn songs by ear, like pop songs and old classic rock and stuff that people listen to a lot where I was from, like Sweet Home Alabama or something like that. So I was doing that, like learning chords by ear and parts and things before I really got into the funk and soul stuff. So, and then it helped to have, like I have good technique from being trained classically, and that helped just being able to play properly and
for sure,
that type of thing. And I'd say the biggest thing I wish I did have was like a jazz piano teacher when I was a kid, because I wish I was better at that. And there just wasn't like anybody in the small town. Like I probably could have found someone if we drove somewhere. I don't know. I had a good classical teacher. She was the music teacher at the elementary school and also gave piano lessons. And so I was fortunate to have that, but I wish there was a jazz, because I started learning a little bit of jazz stuff, mostly just to be able to play R&B voicings and that type of thing in college. And I was just so far behind like my friends that were playing jazz piano. So I was like, I wish I grew up with some of that.
Well, I think we're going to take a little bit of time to kind of hear you play a little bit.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you for talking and sharing a little bit about your experience. How can they find you on social media?
Easiest way is my website's ryanprewett.com. That has my music and some stuff I've produced for other people. But also, Instagram.
And if you're an artist and you want to get into some soul funk kind of stuff, you should definitely hit Ryan Prewett up.
Or if you like listening to it, check it out. Thank
you, man. Let's get down to the instruments, man.
This is a Hammond A100, and it's the same as a B3. There are three models that are basically the same. The B3 is C3 and the A100, and it's a little bit cheaper way to get into a real Hammond that sounds just like a B3, and it's a little bit smaller, which is nice if you don't have a lot of space. It was designed to be like the home version of the B3. It's a little bit smaller, and it used to have an internal speaker that doesn't sound very good. So people will do an easy mod on them to where you can hook it up to a Leslie, and then it's exactly like a B3. So that's what I have. I didn't do any of the work, but a guy I bought it from fixed it up, and I bought the Leslie from him also. And then I had another guy in town, Mark Richardson, do some more work, and now it sounds great. Hopefully it doesn't need anything for a while. That's a pain to get it worked on. But if you ever want to get a real B3, I would get an A100 just because the prices are usually lower, since it's not an actual B3 in the name. So this is my clavinet. It's a D6 model from the 70s. They're a little bit harder to come by nowadays to find one that's in good shape, that doesn't need a lot of work. Most people recognize the clavinet from Superstition by Stevie Wonder, but it was used on tons of music during the 70s, even pop songs and yacht rock and funk and soul and everything. Since I got it a while back, it's been one of my favorite things to have. I'd say it's one thing that plugins haven't perfected. A lot of things, like a Fender Rhodes, I feel like Keyscape sounds better than a lot of Fender Rhodes I've even played on. And Keyscape clavinet sounds good, and there's some other good options. Nord sound good, but it's one thing that when you're actually playing it, I feel like if you do a lot of that type of stuff, which probably isn't that many people, but I do, and it's been a cool thing to have. And it has actual string, so it's kind of like a keyboard version of a guitar. So each note, there's a string in here. Then there are two big pickups that are basically like big humbucker guitar pickups. And so that's why it sounds a lot like a plucky kind of guitar. But then also the cool thing is you can run it through any guitar pedal and it sounds cool. I have this phaser here, and a lot of 70s stuff was the phaser. And so that's cool to have. And then also a Qtron, which is an automated filter, kind of like an auto wah. A lot of stuff in the 70s, when they use clavinets, they'd use a wah pedal, which I also have down there. But an auto wah, it's based on the dynamics of how you play. The signal reacts differently. And so it's cool to have. So that's kind of an iconic 70s sound. It's cool to mix and match this, and you can use distortion pedals and make it crunchy. I have a reissue of a Fender Princeton amp down here I'm playing it through, and gained up, it can sound pretty crunchy. It's a pretty fun thing to have. It's definitely not going to any gigs. It's really heavy. There's a lot of moving parts inside there, and the more that it's rattled around, the more likely I'm going to have to get it worked on. So right now it's pretty perfect shape mechanically and electronically, so it's fun to have. So this is my Prophet 6. It's my favorite synth that I have out of all my analog synths. I definitely use it the most on all kinds of music, all different genres. It's super flexible. It sounds really warm, so it can blend in well with like a pop country track or like worship pads or pretty much anything, but also it can brighten it up and make it like really 80s if you want to do like funky stuff. So I have it going through this Juliana chorus pedal, which is a stereo chorus made by Walrus Effects, and adds that a little more dimension, warm, kind of wide sound. And does some other stuff to kind of, well, you can switch it between a chorus and a vibrato and everywhere in between. And then also after that, I'm going through this Wellspring, which is a spring reverb. It actually has springs in it, and it has a delay and some modulation stuff. And so it can get pretty ambient and vibey. If I turn up the reverb. Then get kind of warbly. But yeah, I'd say this is my most used synth for modern music and retro sound and stuff. It has a lot of capability to go in between everything. It's based on the Prophet 5, which came out in the late 70s. But now you can buy a new Prophet 5, a reissue. But before that, the Prophet 6 was kind of the modern version of that, which it has some cool effects on it too, and stereo output and USB and things that you wouldn't get from a 70s synth, obviously. But yeah, I say I use it the most on all my music and other people's productions. If I do a session outside of here, I usually take just my Nord and this Prophet and can cover everything without having to take like a bunch of stuff somewhere else.